Now, I would like to welcome Hayo Lichen, the director of the International Arctic Research Center, to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Rick. Well, welcome everybody to an early start of the fire season. It's a pleasure to see this many folks out here. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Randi Jandt. Randi works at the International Arctic Research Center. She does a whole bunch of things, and you'll learn more about what she's doing. Her background is in wildlife studies. She got a master's here at UAF, has been working in that arena for about 30 years as a wildlife ecologist, a fire ecologist, at times a firefighter. So I'm looking forward to learning more about that aspect of her job. And now she's working part-time at the International Arctic Research Center as part of the Alaska Fire Science Consortium. So Alaska Fire Science Consortium, you'll hear a bit more about it in Randi's talk, I think, but I do want to point you to this nice little bookmark here. It's an interesting construct, and it's successful because of people like Randi. Randi brings together expertise from the fire management community. She's a former fire manager to some extent as well. She creates links between different groups of experts who are tasked with dealing with wildfire hazards, wildfire management and response. And what makes this interesting from the perspective of the university is that we're serving as the host of these types of conversations where fire managers from different agencies and communities can get access to the best that cutting-edge research has to offer in terms of what are some new approaches to deal with some of these fire hazards. And it's because of people like Randi that this actually works. I would like to highlight also Alison York here, who's the coordinator for the Alaska Fire Science Consortium. So if you have questions about various aspects of Randi's work or the Alaska Fire Science Consortium, Alison will be able to help you as well. And some of this is relevant at the community level. I know Randi is interested in looking at how effective are different types of fire breaks. You know, what can you do at the community or even local homeowner or property owner level? And those are also types of questions that AFSC is dealing with. But now we're going to get to the cutting edge of fire science and fire research, and Randi's going to share with us her answers to the question of whether defrosting the icebox is going to give us more summer wildfires. Thanks, Randi.
Thank you very much, Hayo. I appreciate that. The Alaska Fire Science Consortium, although we're housed at the university, might be interested to know that our funding actually comes from all the agencies who manage wildfire. So Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management, Alaska Fire Service, Forest Service. That's who funds us, because we are to bring them together with cutting edge research and focus the talent that the university has and research groups all over the country on practical fire questions that they need to know now. So that's our mission in a nutshell. So without further ado, let's see if I can make this thing work. There we go. How's the volume? Can you hear me there in the back? Does it sound okay? Too loud? No? Okay, good. Okay, so some of you might be thinking this is kind of a dumb question. If it's getting warmer, then yeah, there'll probably be more fires. But I'd like to take us under the hood tonight and look at some of the interactions between not only climate and fire regime, but also some of the other environmental factors that have a strong influence on what will really happen with fires in the future. And I will be relying on the research of a veritable village of scientists and a few of my own studies to do this. So what's the icebox? Well, I'm sure you figured out that's Alaska, and it's a pretty big icebox. Did you know that it's 18% of the United States land mass in the icebox? And depending on who you talk to, stores between a third and a half of the organic carbon for the United States. So it's significant. It also turns out that it's a really good laboratory to study the effect of climate on wildfire regime as opposed to management practices and things because of our relative lack of things like logging once you get off the major river corridors and our relatively short history of fire suppression in the state. So this is a really interesting area to look at, and of course we're warming twice as fast as the lower 48. We've warmed about 4 degrees since 1950, as this graph shows in the state. This is just annual average temperature. And interestingly enough, did you realize this? That 5 of the 10 warmest years on record have been in the last decade? Did you realize that? So it is warming quickly, and I would like to first look at the big picture and some of the environmental impacts that are a result of this warming, and then so we don't think about the fire regime in isolation, but as part of this larger picture. So if you attended Dr. Martin Stufer's lecture, Some Like It Hot, then you might have seen this graph on Arctic sea ice extent, which is shrinking by about 4% per decade on average, or if you just think about the minimum sea ice extent in the fall, which is usually in September, that's down 40% in the satellite era, which is quite a contraction. And it's also becoming thinner, but the extent, the area, surface area of that ice is the most important thing that influences radiative forcing and inducing both regional warming effects and feedbacks to global warming. Sea ice extent, as it turns out, is one of the big factors in this phenomenon called Arctic amplification, whereby as the Earth warms, a lot of that warming is happening faster up in our neck of the woods, as you can see on this diagram showing about a decade of temperature anomalies, and lots of red up in the northern hemisphere. And some of that is due to sea ice contraction, and also it's giving us maybe just a little more rainfall. It's also happening with terrestrial ice. So in this graph from the 4th National Climate Assessment that just came out this fall, the Alaska glacier mass, as shown, indicated by the stars, declining rapidly, especially since about 1990s. And even more remarkably, this is happening with underground ice. So this permafrost, this is really our legacy from the ice ages. Very little of this kind of ice was formed in the last 10,000 years in the Holocene. Most of this is old ice. And it occurs in various concentrations in the soil. Some places are almost pure ice wedges like this, and other places just have a high ice content. So what the remarkable thing is how quickly this is warming all across the state. And maybe you heard this, the Kenai Peninsula. They just realized the Kenai Peninsula has lost almost half of its permafrost in the last 60 years. That is very rapid change. So the projections for the balance of the century are that by the end of this century, Alaska could lose as much as 25% of its permafrost. And obviously here in the interior, we'll have a front seat for this. It has big implications for infrastructure, but it also has big implications for forests and for wildfire. The melting of that ice globally could release about 1.5 billion tons of CO2 to the atmosphere. And to put that in comparison, that's about the same as the annual release of CO2 from all fossil fuels burning in the United States. So that is a significant amount. It's probably already occurred to you that there could be sort of a vicious cycle set up here by where more greenhouse gases may lead to more heating and more melting and more fires. The point I'd like to make that with this ice driven deeper or disappearing in the ground, this moss duff that underlies our forests here in the forest floor can dry out more quickly and is more susceptible to ignite and burn. So here is, that's exactly what Jim Reardon is getting ready to do here down at the Missoula Fire Lab a few years back. He's going to experimentally burn an Alaska duff plug, we call this, to see how a moisture content affects the burning. And so this duff plug, this is very recognizable towards the surface as moss, and then it gets a little more decomposed down here, but moss decomposes really slowly up here in our climate. And then at the bottom you get down into mineral soil, which would be rock, silt, dirt, whatever you want to call it, gravel. So also that moss layer is an important insulator of the permafrost. Each centimeter of thickness here can reduce the subsurface temperature by almost a degree. So it's also got an important function to insulate. And so these drier moss layers could also, not only do they ignite more easily, but they could also burn deeper during a wildfire. What would that look like? Here's a typical low severity burn scar. I know this because most of the moss layer is still there. The roots of these trees are primarily rooted into that moss layer. And if the moss layer would burn deeply, then, like it did around this white spruce, where it was dried down deeper to mineral soil here, and it burned away all the roots of this tree, and this tree is going down with the first puff of wind, and all the other plants that were rooted around here are gone as well. So how about this one? This looks kind of bad at first sight. This was the aftermath of a 2004 fire up on the Steese Highway up by Central. And it was a muskegee, low-lying black spruce area with a lot of tussocks and shrubs like Labrador tea and blueberry when the fire burned. So it looks bad, but the thing is, it was so low-lying that it had a lot of near-surface permafrost ice, and that permafrost, the moisture from it protected the moss, making it too moist to burn, and so most of the moss layer is actually preserved here. Some has been removed, but these trees, you can see, they're all still standing. The tussocks, the spring after this fire burned, are already regenerating, even though some of their leaf mass was burned away. And really, this area is going to come back to just pretty much exactly what it was before, through resprouting, and those spruce trees will seed back in. So from a fire ecologist standpoint, I would only rate this as like a moderate severity. So thawing can lead to more fire, but vice versa as well. The aftermath of fire can lead to profound and long-lasting melting and subsidence in tundra, which is, this picture here shows fire on the Seward Peninsula, which had some pretty dramatic effects a few years after the fire. This happens because where we have those large ice wedges, or where the soil is maybe composed of maybe 50% or so of granular ice, when that goes away, then the surface drops. So we see these effects, and it also is occurring, it occurs in boreal forest as well, and can last for some time after fire. Okay, so back to fire. I know you've all seen some of this kind of thing in the literature. Is this media hyperbole? And I would propose to you that no, I think we can demonstrate that we are in fact seeing an intensification of wildfire, at least in Alaska and in Canada. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Here's the typical graph showing the acres burned by year in Alaska going back to 1950. And one thing that you will notice is in the last 20, 30 years, these bars that exceed the white, which is 1 million acres in a summer, are closer together. And in fact, we've seen that the frequency of large fires has doubled in the last 30 years in Alaska. And the acres burned goes along with that as well. An interesting side note is that back in the early part of the 1960s, and I wasn't here yet, I didn't come until the mid-1980s to Alaska, but I guess it was unusually cool in that period, especially in the summer. And look what happened to fires in that time. I came up here in 1986 just for one summer to be a firefighter, and I did that for a few years, and then I decided I liked Alaska pretty well, and I got really interested in wildlife and in fires and how they interacted, and Dave Klein was kind enough to take me on as a grad student, and the rest is history. So, okay, so another line of evidence here is that parts of Alaska are seeing return of fire in shorter intervals. So this study here using the charcoal layers and lake sediment cores shows that in some regions of Alaska, the interval between burning in some parts is shorter than it has been in a very long time. So it's becoming clear through a multitude of studies just how sensitive the boreal fire regime is to temperature, and primarily, of course, it's summer temperatures. And the reason has to do with this forest floor that underlies a lot of our forests. So Jen is showing another duff plug here laid out. This kind of moss can, in a week or two of warm, dry weather, can dry down, say, 4 inches or so, and that is actually enough for wildfires to spread and become large. So that is the secret, and even less time if you're talking about the dead grass litter and lichens out in the tundra. It doesn't take much time to get into a fire-ready condition. Contrast that to what is required to dry out that heavy woody slash in western coniferous forests, where they require much more extended drought, or maybe even a low winter snowpack to get into an extreme fire situation. But here, temperature can operate very rapidly, and so this graph here showing the trend in the maximum daily temperatures through time, back to 1950 again, shows just how dramatic that trend has been, those temperatures going up. So it's the drying of the moss that determines fire danger. And it's the moss that carries the fire across the surface. It's also the moss that has most of the biomass available for burning. So in a typical black spruce stand around here, this moss can have maybe 20 to 30 tons per acre of biomass, more than double than what would be in the trees. So it is an important source of biomass. This is a picture from the Fort McMurray fire in 2016. Anybody remember that one? It was in the early spring. And that fire, it burned up a Fairbanks-sized town. They evacuated 88,000 people. It burned up the town. I mean, the downtown, the businesses, the cars, the infrastructure, the whole thing burned up, and about 1.5 million acres of forest with it. And, certainly, and the insurance losses from that event, last I heard, they were over $3.5 billion with the B dollars, the largest private insurance losses in Canadian history from any natural disaster. That was big. And so, certainly, getting 90-degree temperatures in early May in northwestern Alberta was an extreme event. But as the climate warms, it makes extremes like this more possible. So now let's talk about the future a little bit. This is a very useful projection that Rick Lader and a group of meteorologists just came out with recently that tells us about the number of very warm days to expect in the future. So right now, the status quo is that almost no place in Alaska is lighting up with any pink here that has more than 10 days over 77 degrees a year, right? Almost no pink here. Go down to mid-century, however, and by 2041 to 2070, you see a lot of pink here. In fact, you see a lot of this next rose color, the second mark here. So many places now have over 30 days a year, 3 times as many by mid-century. And I don't even know if I want to think about this projection for the end of the century when the statewide average supposedly would be 30 days a summer. And some of the places have, this darker color is like 60 days over 77 degrees a summer. So now remembering that those very warm days are what we need to dry out the fuel beds, and that actually most of the burning once the fires start happens on those very warm days as well, we expect this kind of thing right here to have a really big impact on fire danger indices in Alaska. And I should mention that this was done using a business as usual climate scenario. So that is just basically your economic-driven model of the future. We're not all going to go out and buy electric cars, and we're not going to shut down our coal-fired power plants anytime soon. We're going to let economics and whatever drive the selection of fuels. So business as usual. Doesn't seem too far out. So with that warming, also, we expect to see more lightning. There was a study published in Science in 2014 where they tried to quantify that, and they feel that each degree Celsius of warming, or it's 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, would bring about 12% more lightning. So what would that mean for burn area in Alaska? Here's the meat of the question, right? So Sander Ververebecke is a colleague who is an expert in remote sensing and modeling, and I was a minor co-author on this study in 2017. But he tried to, again, using a business as usual climate scenario, see how much lightning how much burning we have now, and he assembled a huge data set of all the lightning detection data from BLM and all the satellite detected MODIS hotspots of actual fire on the ground in Alaska over the 30 years. And he put together a picture of the status quo, which is what I'm showing you with the red box here. Then, so that's kind of how much burning we've seen since 1980, right? And then he added 5 degrees Fahrenheit and 19 millimeters, or about 3/4 of an inch of rainfall by mid-century. And by the way, if this looks like fun to you here, I think Mike Buteri from State Forestry is back there somewhere. He might have a job for you. But anyway, Sander found that under that scenario, lightning would be up about 59%, with a 78% increase in lightning-ignited wildfires. And that would translate into burn area being up by 55% or 46% if you account for a stronger feedback by maybe converting the forest to younger stand types. If you don't do that, account for a negative feedback from fuels conversion, and if you just model what we've seen in climate and what it's produced in fire acres burned over the years, you could get much higher projections. Actually, there have been several papers published looking at 200 to 400% increases in acres burned in Alaska by the end of the century. But I think this more conservative view, we do think there will be some negative feedbacks from fuel conversion. At the same time, we've seen longer fire seasons developing in Alaska. 2016 wasn't a notable year in terms of the acres burned, but it was notable for the earliest smoke jumper fire on record in 67 years of smoke jumping history down by Palmer on the Nick River. That's what this is here. April 17th that was. And in mid-October, over here, the state of Alaska was still fighting a fairly significant wildland-urban interface fire down by Anchorage, making it a 6-month fire season for Alaska, which is not what we expect. Normally Memorial Day to Labor Day, that should be it. But the satellite data also shows us we're getting fewer days of snow cover, about 4 fewer days per decade of snow cover. And if you want to talk about growing seasons, we can look at that data here. I like this graph from Rick Toman and John Walsh. They showed this at a webinar in the fall, but everybody always wants to know about growing season. And if you are in the right area around Fairbanks, you could have enjoyed a 30% increase in growing season, frost-free length since 1952. Look at Talkeetna, 41%. Kenai, 38%. So not every place. You know, it's certainly variable across the state, but most of the fire-prone interior has experienced this longer growing season. Did you hear about Bethel this year? Bethel had a 155-day growing season. Think about that. So what are the forests doing in the light of, longer growing seasons? Are they growing faster and with more CO2 in the atmosphere? Are the trees responding positively to this? Well, it's interesting. Our northern tree species, like these poor black spruce, they're not very well adapted to take advantage of these enhanced growing conditions. They're very water conservative. As soon as it gets above about 70 degrees, they just close up their stomata in their leaves, in their needles, and they stop photosynthesizing. So they're not growing. And so actually, we have seen more of a trend for slower growth in most of the interior tree species. Here is another example of radioisotope uptake studies looking at how trees take in nutrients to grow, has also documented slower growth in most of the dominant species in Alaska forests since the 1980s, interior Alaska. At the same time, we realized that the forest pests like these longer seasons, warm seasons, and so things like the spruce bark beetle can really go to town. You've probably heard about the big spruce bark beetle outbreaks going on around Anchorage now in the last couple of years. So the forest pests like the longer seasons, but the trees, not so much. Here's a graph from Beck et al., which shows how another way to measure it by the annual tree ring increment. So how big is the tree ring it lays down that year? How much should it grow in a year? And notice that in interior Alaska, these white spruce trees have a negative correlation between annual ring width increment and temperature for all the summer months, May, June, July, and August, negative correlation. However, in coastal Alaska, and these white spruce were from around Dillingham, when they're not water limited, they don't seem to have the same conservative strategy. Anyway, they show a positive correlation of growth with temperature in the early spring and early summer especially. All right, so here's a question I can't answer yet. I would like to be able to answer this. Are we seeing, a trend for wildfires becoming more severe? You could imagine why we might, because of what I just talked about with moss drying and increased temperatures. But we just don't have enough data yet. And when I talk about severity, I'm talking about something perhaps different than you're thinking. Which of these pictures shows a severe fire? Well, a lot of people are going to go, that one. No, that is an intense fire with towering flame lengths, 50 or 100-foot flame lengths and lots of heat being released. That's fire intensity. But I can't tell you yet if that fire is severe in terms of its leaving very pronounced ecological impacts. This fire, to me, is severe because it has burned away most of that moss, and the trees have toppled over because there wasn't anything for their roots to be in anymore. It may have not been a very intense fire. I mean, the scorch heights on this birch is only a couple feet high. So they don't necessarily go hand in hand. But what I can tell you is if we saw more fires burning deeper. That would transform our forests. So a deep burning fire like this, which removes all of the rhizomes, roots, and runners down here and burns down to mineral soil, the recovery from that fire starts from scratch. And there's an opportunity there for colonizing types of plants, maybe more grasses or willows with windblown seed, or birch and aspen to come in and start a relay succession on this site. So if we saw more deep burning fires, that would make a big difference in our fuelscapes. Now, I'd like to go for a moment, take you to the North Slope and show you a case study of a severe fire. But this is a tundra fire. This was the Anaktuvuk River fire. It started in 2007. It was lightning caused in July. And it burned this little yellow patch right here. And then it kind of went to sleep. And then as the summer on the North Slope that year became hotter and drier, it woke up again and it went to town and it burned all of this red and pink area, most of it in about 1 week in September. But it just kept burning and smoldering until it was actually covered up by snow sometime in October. And at the end of September, on September 30th, in this satellite image, this is a pretty big fire now, 250,000 acres, about 70 miles from north to south, big fire. It's still smoldering here, but these white snowball-looking things are the lakes, actually, which have already frozen over. So here's a plot from some of the permanent transects we set up. Now, I have to tell you, it is very unusual, very rare to see consumption to mineral soil like this in a tundra fire in Alaska. I've looked for it a long time, and it's very hard to find. Even anywhere, in boreal forest, anywhere in Alaska, you don't often get this. Now, if you go to California, Nevada, or someplace like that, you will see more of this kind of consumption. But this fire did have some of this effect. Nevertheless, within our transects, even if they were severely burned by about 4 years, that's what it looked like on a severely burned transect. There's vegetation again. There's some fireweeds, some horsetail, some fire mosses. And by 10 years out, pretty good vegetation reestablished there. Arguably, the plant productivity might be the same as it was before the fire. We documented some fairly substantial thawing and melting of the ice now, of the underground ice on this fire, especially along its western extent on the Anaktuvuk River, where these landscape scale patches actually gave way, mass wasting again. This was caused by a tremendous amount of melting from large ice wedges, like in that photo I showed you previously, which was actually from this fire. And even on our transects themselves, we documented this kind of thermokarst effect where, this was the plot immediately after the burn, and 10 years later, I about need hip boots to get out there and remeasure that. And that's not rainwater there. That water came out of the ground. It's a thermokarst that formed by, there was a lot of ice content in that soil, and as it became warmer after the burn and it melted out, it created this slump. So from the helicopter, you can appreciate that some of this ground was patterned at the time of the burn. These are frost-created kind of cracks between big wedges or polygons in the landscape, but they were small. I could step over them easily. They were maybe a foot deep. After 10 years later, there's vegetation covering this area again, but the ground is there's more topography out there, and these cracks have become deeper. As you can see, that's the same area. Now I'm down on the ground there, and some of those cracks that were a foot deep before are quite a bit bigger. I remember one on the north end of the fire. I could hide the whole helicopter in. Maybe the rotor would stick out, but that's it. But there were some examples of places where this really was a big effect. Here's one of our transects that this is the end stake of a 50-meter transect. It used to be kind of, I don't know, it was 6 feet from where it is now, because this whole landscape sort of slid downhill as this thermokarst pond formed at the end down here. So some pretty interesting effects. Here from the helicopter again. See how smooth it looks on the unburned side over here? And on the other side, you can really pick up the topography now, can't you? And then notice they're both vegetated. Plenty of vegetation on both sides now. So we had Dr. Ben Jones was our colleague, and he went on this field trip in 2017 as well. And he used a remote sensing technique called LiDAR, flown from an aircraft to quantify the amount of subsidence on this whole burn area, which developed a few years after the burn. In 2009, not a big effect yet. It's not obvious. By 2014, it's pretty obvious that the whole area has sunk. And the LiDAR in this colored diagram tells us that it's sunk from about 1 foot in the blue to 3 feet where it's red. It's a landscape scale effect, which Ben found can last for a long time. Like, we're talking a couple hundred years, because he was actually able to find some prehistoric fires up on the North Slope by taking this knowledge and then going, let's look for some really rough areas that are, sunken with respect to nearby areas, and they were able to document a couple really old fires. So it can be a long-lasting effect. So back to our transects, they have pretty much revegetated. I'll show you just a couple more pictures. I guess you might say, because of this lush vegetation on the transects, severely burned areas had a lot of these grasses, and of course the willows are coming in. Would you say it's recovered? Yeah, I guess you could say it's recovered in one sense, but the plant communities are not exactly the same composition as they were before. So the vascular plants, like the grasses and the willows and the shrubs, those kinds of things are doing well. The bryophytes, you know what I mean by bryophytes? They're like the mosses and the lichens, the liverworts, and all those other little creatures. They don't grow so fast, and they can't take advantage of that deeper thaw either. So anyway, the plant communities are a little bit different. Lichens, boy, I had a hard time finding any to even photograph. I found this little sprig of regenerating lichen, or caribou moss, and compare it to the size of this cotton grass seed. But only, those would develop in places where they're not being overtopped by competing grasses or willows or those tussocks that are going crazy up there. Willows, tall willows, and these willows, they hold snow in the winter. And what does deeper snow do on tundra on the North Slope in the winter? Well, it actually insulates the ground from the cold, so the cold can't penetrate as deep and reform that permafrost as easily. So it actually kind of helps the thawing process. The other fascinating thing we found was we found 2 new burn scars in our 10-year-old fire scar. Why is that a big deal? Well, this is an area where the charcoal sediment studies, again from coring lakes, show very little record of fire on the North Slope, very infrequent. So if you estimated a fire return interval, it might be 1,000 years. It's supposed to be very long time between fires. But, these fires had burned, we thought within 10 days of us getting there, those fires had burned. They did not burn very deep. Here on the ground at that fire, notice that within 10 days, the cotton grass is already greened up and growing vigorously, and the leaves on these shrubs that were probably just beginning to leaf out, they got scorched, but they're going to come right back. So again, vascular plants are going to respond positively to this reburn, and it just kind of burned away a little more of the insulation and all the old leaf litter. But, you know, what I wanted to say was that maybe we shouldn't have been too surprised because of the rate of warming up there on the North Slope with Anaktuvuk, the town formerly known as Barrow. I mean, think about that. 8 of its 10 warmest years in a century of record keeping since 2010. And we already discussed how more warming can bring more lightning. And yeah, it was 80 degrees on 3, I think we were up there for about 10 days or a little more than that. It was 80 degrees on the North Slope for 3 of those days. And we saw 3 lightning storms. So it does seem that things are changing up on the North Slope. Okay, finally, I just wanted to talk about this question a little bit because I've heard it debated a lot recently. Are we to blame at all for this intensification of wildfire phenomenon? Well, certainly you can't call any wildfire a disaster unless humans are involved. If it's just a fire out there burning in the tundra or out burning in the forest, that's a natural phenomenon. But certainly what happened in Paradise, California at the campfire this fall, you know, with 85 fatalities and 14,000 structures destroyed, and that qualifies as a disaster. So I guess more specifically, let's ask the question, is the human contribution to greenhouse gases and the warming that brought, is that tipping the scale towards these big, intense wildfire events? And there's something kind of new out there called an attribution study, where they take the amount of warming attributable to these greenhouse gases we've been producing in the post-industrial era, and they subtract them from the climate model. And it works because there's such a crazy good relationship between global temperature and these gases. Look at carbon dioxide compared to global temperature since 1880. I mean, they're almost in lockstep. So if you have a supercomputer available, it's just a physics question, right? And so there was one of these studies done recently in Alaska, and they looked at the 2015 fire season. Anybody remember the 2015 fire season? It was our 3rd largest fire season, burned 5.1 million acres. The fires weren't as close to Fairbanks, perhaps, but the remarkable thing about it was that after fire season started in July that year, within 2 weeks we went from less than 1 million acres to 5 million. I mean, 4 million acres basically caught on fire in about 2 weeks. It was really a rapid ramping up of events, and if we had not had that fortuitous 2.5 inches of rain that came in the latter part of July that year. Remember that? That put a damper on things. But if it hadn't been for that, we would have had some new all-time record acres burned that I can't even imagine. So this group with Partain et al., they used the UAF supercomputing facility, and they looked at whether the human-caused portion of the climate being warmer would have contributed to the 2015 fuel and weather conditions that year. And what they found is that those conditions were 34 to 60% more likely to occur in the anthropogenically changed climate than in the pre-industrial climate. And it's not just Alaska. Here's a California attribution study. And in this study, they're looking at the number of extreme fire danger days a year on the scale. And again, a Partain study, and this one as well. We're all using the same climate projection here, the business as usual climate projection for this. And notice that until about 1970, somewhere in there, there's about 10 such days a year, 10 extreme fire danger days a year. The pre-industrial climate would continue at that rate, but adding then the amount of gases in the post-industrial time and the warming that they brought, by now we're up to 30 days a year, 30 days extreme fire danger days a year. And the projections look like they are going to continue that as the climate continues to warm, primarily due to the influence of temperature on this Keach-Byram Drought Index, the black line, which is a big indicator of fire danger and risk in California. So I guess thinking about this, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised. We keep hearing about California in the news. It seems like every year now. Do you realize that they've actually had 5 of their all-time most destructive fires since 2010? So, I guess in conclusion, it does appear that we're likely to see more wildfire in Alaska as the climate warms, something on the order of 50 to 200% more by mid or the end of the century. However, it's hard to say what's going to happen without considering climate and also permafrost, hydrology, forest conditions and composition, but all of these things have their own experts. And that's why at University of Alaska, they're developing some interdisciplinary teams to look at some of these big questions, including one called EPSCoR, Fire and Ice. I saw a couple of the PIs for that are actually here in the room tonight. And they just won a round of funding from the National Science Foundation. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of that study, a 6-year study. So finally, such a discussion really leads to the question, what can we do about an intensifying wildfire regime? And the same discussions are going on in California now, let me assure you. Bills are being written, etc. So I'm pleased to say that we also have staff here tonight from the North Star Borough Department of Emergency Services, Baird Stifel and Bill Whittier over there. And they've got some sign-up things here. They're actually starting a process whereby they want to look at how to make Fairbanks a more fire-safe and fire-resistant community. So you might want to stop by, get a business card, or get on their mailing list for that. And with that, I guess we'll take some questions if there are any.
Thank you.